Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Hey there, energized listeners, and welcome back to the Grid Mod Pod. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cook, your guide through all electrifying landscapes of grid modernization. And today we have our co-host, Brett Ryhal, joining us as we're going to talk about all things infrastructure and what it takes to execute some of these large projects.
Thanks for having me back on, Liz. So, we've been talking a lot about the utility, a lot about integration of some of these new smart grid assets that can go on the grid. Let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's get a little bit deeper into some of these avenues. So what are the essential steps in executing some of these projects? We have some large scale infrastructure projects, and what's needed to support the electrification, for transportation and other sectors that you see coming out of the utility industry?
And I think, as we talk through this, we're going to be flipping the script a little bit as, my background really comes from conceptually creating the idea and identifying the need or, creating the conversation with our customers. And then what you quickly find out, as you grow and, do these projects, there's a significant amount of work that needs to happen before you actually put plant in service. So hopefully in this conversation, we can kind of enlighten those folk that it is, the idea can be great, even identifying the funding and, the drivers and the need, but actually getting the work done takes a lot of steps in between. So, when you ask, what are the essential steps, what I think about is, one is the feasibility study, really doing a comprehensive analysis of, what the technical perspective is, but then also, of course, the financial, and then now more importantly is really the environmental, perspective of how this project's going to show up, and are you going to meet the goals that are really being identified for the customer, for the company, for the developer. And when we talk electrification, it's no longer just a one-way street. There's a synergy that we really have to have these discussions up front, because there's an impact to the grid and there's a driver from the customer. And so doing that study together is really important. And then I'll kind of get to the point where, because we could talk about this all day, is really that stakeholder engagement. So depending on who develops the project and what the need is, there's not only those that are constructing it or wanting constructing it for the needs being asked of, but it's the surrounding community, it's the regulatory bodies, and really it's all different perspectives that need to be gathered and to really address concerns before you break ground. Then comes the fundamental design and planning. So that's doing the engineering design, right? And that's kind of where your expertise is. So, I come with the conceptual idea and some of the stakeholder engagement aligned. And then really the next step is the technical feasibility and the cost. So that's when we need the engineering design, which I think that's where you step in real nicely to kind of talk about to our listeners.
Yeah. And you touched on some things with the feasibility and the stakeholder engagement. And, we've worked on quite a few great projects so far, and across the industry. I've done plenty of them. A lot of times we skip those first two steps. They seem almost ignored in a lot of cases. And you just go, got a great idea. I think it's going to be a great idea. It's going to be profitable. Let's go. And you mentioned that funding and getting some of these grants that are out there while they're currently available, you have to have a really good idea of what you're doing almost before you ask for the money. And yet you have to come up with a really good plan. So that's where that 5%, 10% design comes into play. And, you mentioned a second item that I think I want to touch a little bit on. It is stakeholder engagement. Many of these projects, involve land usage, whether that's private property, commercial property, sometimes even federal property. And while previously those agreements were from probably the utility aspect, very cut and dried. We're just installing a transformer for a cul-de-sac, and we're going to put up a new pole. Some of these investments are a lot larger, and they are very similar to putting in a small substation in square footage wise and plot land wise. So you need to have the local sewer and gas. You need to have even your parks and rec. You need to have government engagement. And we skipped these two major steps, and then we head right to, I got a great idea, let's get a design. And there could be a lot of wasted money and a lot of wasted engineering design time and energy in having this idea that would have worked really well if we just opened up the doors and said, hey, we have a great idea. We have 3 site locations. Which one's the best? So, then the follow-up does come with the design and planning. So, and that's one of our key focuses in the industry that I operate in. It is very unique for your vehicle charging, V2G, for your battery energy storage, for your solar and wind. These green energy initiatives and these new smart technologies do require a little bit of advanced planning. As we found, nobody has a go-by yet. There's no standard template. The IEC, the NESC has very limited coverage on some of these items, where if you went in there for cable sizing, it almost would inundate you to the point where your head's spinning. So some of these are brief and a paragraph long and say it's 125% of your amperage, and design it to that, and you're like, that's it. That's the only guide that I have. So these do require, especially with all the different manufacturers and all the different players right now, the market is not consolidated at all. Really have to spend a lot of time of making sure that integration is there and that the parts are going to connect together like Lego bricks. So we talk a lot about dealing with the government and regulatory compliance. You need to make sure that your state and local government are involved. You and I have both heard multiple times, great idea, a local business or a local school or whatever, we're going to do it. This is our idea. And they don't involve the utility. They don't involve the state or the local government at all until they're 80% down the road. And, they come in and say, from a utility aspect, they'll come in and say, well, that's great idea, but it's a $4 million upgrade for us to install your $200,000 project. That's not, if you would have come to us earlier, we could have shown you that if you put it 2 blocks to the west,
right,
it would have been fine. It would have worked great.
And I mean, from the lessons that I've learned and just observing, the conversations, I think, one of my key drivers of showing up and really sharing this perspective is, I think there's a lot of thought that if you give it a first go and you find yourself running into an obstacle, what's a quote I use, obstacles do not block the path, they are the path, that we have to have grace with ourselves that we're learning as we're doing. And I think that a lot of times there's those that just go straight forward without understanding the stakeholders that need to be engaged. But then there's also the others that actually don't get started because of fear of all of the stakeholders that need to be engaged, of the unknown. And so, you mentioned quite a few things, right? Like the regulatory compliance, or engaging not only your state understanding of what can be and cannot be, but also, if you're dealing with transmission, you're looking at the federal, and then also the local is, really just engaging the community so they ensure that whatever the big project are doing, doesn't impact them in adverse ways. And so I think the key, and I like to keep all the conversations hopeful because I think it becomes very daunting that these projects can be challenging. But just as we think about, grid modernization is preparing the grid and really turning the conversation around where the utilities need the partnership with those that want to connect as we deploy these new technologies. And so when we say new technologies, those that were former listeners of all things DER, we're talking about, as you said, the solar, the wind, the battery chargers, car chargers, the batteries, etc. And that's new to all of us. So just from your perspective, coming from a project management where, let's just say, project is conceptually made, feasibility has been checked, the financial capital stack has been secured, what has you found to be an effective project management engagement to really have that seamless integration with the infrastructure project and those that are involved?
So I think that's a pretty fair question. That's a pretty daunting question too, because it does hedge away from your standard substation transmission line development, which I've done for for 2 decades now. One is schedule. We always talk about scope, schedule, budget. In a typical utility deliverable, scope, schedule, budget doesn't really change much, and that's because you know what a substation is supposed to be. You know their standards and equipment. When you are wading into this murkier water and these new areas, your scope 100%, you have to keep that on track, and not necessarily scope of I want 24 chargers on site, or I would like a 3 megawatt battery. But you need to start having a little bit more flexibility. And the targeted goal is to have a battery that's suitable for the distribution system on site. You just can't take a plug and play, churn and burn mentality to it. You really have to go back to engineering design principles 101, and it's check, validate, check, revalidate. And that's the same thing with the chargers. While you and I may have you selected a charger for one of the projects, I'm going to churn and burn. We're just gonna plug it and play. It really you have to use a little bit more of the gray matter. So dig down deep, look at the specs, look at the design of that charger, and think: is this really suitable for this site? Is this going to work not just from the electrical standpoint, but to accommodate a total number of cars? Is it going to be able to accommodate ADA capabilities? Are the charging lines long enough for an ADA vehicle? Et cetera, et cetera. So you really do have to do a continual check and recheck on a lot of the equipment that you're trying to install. And some of the projects that we've run into, even the tie-in and integration back into the grid requires a check and recheck. A lot of the standard equipment that's on the menu for most utilities is not going to be suitable for some of these backfeed situations. So you want to install a standard recloser and you just think it's going to be fine. Well, does it have backfeed capability? Does it have the ability to island itself properly and monitor both the supply and the load side of that line? So you really have to kind of dig down into the fun. It's actually brilliantly fun. Like, if I could challenge any engineer to go into it now, this is the time, because it goes back to like textbook 101 of like, okay, you made an assumption. Validate it. Know why you made the assumption. Just don't run with the idea and go forward with it. So,
And kind of like listening to what you said, and I think, another thing about our industry and being very technical and engineering and, engineering the solution and then breaking it down, we forget, it's really important to keep the objective or the vision, in sight, and then really keeping that at the forefront while you're navigating through, fairly comprehensive projects. So the key to, for project management is really having that structure of collaborative team, so you communicate effectively. That comes in all ways, shapes, and form. And I think, it can be grown, but it's something just to be aware that it's very important. And I also heard you say that ensure that you are breaking the project down into really manageable phases. So you really aren't trying to, what was the saying, boil the ocean, or
you don't boil the
swallow the elephant. Is that another one? So really breaking it down, that continuous monitoring, right? You can't really continuously monitoring something unless you break it down in small phases, and then really ensuring that you're managing your risks. And I guess, maybe from your experience, do you have any, examples of really where that continuous monitoring and effective communication with your team, avoided, a potential impact to a large project?
Yeah, and I think the team monitoring and the team collaboration and the continuous monitoring kind of go hand in hand, right? These types of projects do require you to do more check-ins. They do require you to have all the stakeholder engagements. Things change on the utility side. The laws seem to want to change weekly. So, what qualifies, what doesn't qualify. You have to be very nimble on your feet and very adaptive. So you do want to have those weekly check-ins. It might seem for a smaller project a little overboard, where on a very large scale 345 kV substation, you checking in weekly seems like a good idea. on these, you want to do a once a month. No, you should be doing it weekly, and you should be doing it with the land management, with any of the local state and government agencies that have some input. And you want to keep a I'd say really good, everybody knows it's on the program and project management side, action item list or tasking list. A lot of these tasks aren't in SOP for a utility, or not in an SOP for a government organization.
SOP?
A standard operating procedure. That's fair. So when you say, hey, can you go and validate that the funding is still there in your organization? A lot of people don't know who to even contact. A lot of people don't know if the project is still going to move forward. So it does challenge us to get a little bit outside of our box and be independent owners of each little subtask that's there. So really those weekly meetings are critically important, and then continuously monitoring that project. It does require a little bit more hands-on techniques.
Bringing it back again, I think this is another new thread that I'm going to continuously pull on is, so from a project scope, a budget and a timeline, that's the what. So you're really measuring success of the project based on the what, but really the important part is staying also aware of the why behind the what, and then really the how or the who. And so it's, again, it comes down to this people perspective, which I think is fascinating, because everything that's happening in our industry, we're in this midst of this fourth industrial revolution where the new technology.
I love
what?
that, by the way. I love that quote, by the way. It is the fourth industrial revolution.
It really is. I mean, we are in a pivotal moment in our history of, one, in general history, but in two, of how we use energy. It's no longer how we use it. It's really how, when, where, and who. And so all of that variable is changing daily with the inventions that we're creating. So I think we also lose sight that there's a lot of investment going on. I think I heard the number, totality across everything that's happening with the private and really some of these fundings that are becoming available, is $170 trillion of driving towards electrification of the edge of the grid. Right, wrong, or different. And that's thinking about embracing new technologies. But to really execute on them, it's going to take the people to understand how to manage like all of these mini little projects. So I think what we're talking about is really important to really pull up, and the importance of, yes, the scope, the budget, and the timeline. That just gets you started. And then finding that successful way to complete and then scale. We have our hands full, but I think I always like to talk in hopeful terms that we've done these types of transformations before in our past. This is just at a grander scale, and we really need to ensure that we have the right thought processes set up. So from your perspective, we have been talking about obstacles, but, what do you see from your perspective of different obstacles in regards to this transformation that's happening?
So I think I'll get on a soapbox for a few seconds.
Okay.
I think the big obstacle right now is we have a very polarized society of green is good, green is bad. EV is good, EV is bad. I'll never own an electric car. I'm always going to own an ICE vehicle, internal combustion engine. Or I love EV, I'll never change back. Okay, fair. Taking a step back from our internal biases, and maybe necessarily, I've great examples. I've told you this 1,000 times. I own a couple of diesel trucks. I own a couple F-150s, and my very first thought when I saw that Ford Lightning was, I can literally back up my home off of this. Skip all the other pluses to it. I saw that and I thought, this is like engineer 101. I get giddy. I'm like, how many watts is it? How many kilowatts is it? How long can I run my home off this? Very first thing I thought of was, how can I V2G this thing? And that was literally before V2G even became really a V2X, V2G, vehicle to grid, vehicle to everything, became even like a colloquial term in the industry. I'm like, we can wire this thing so it can power my home. So I found, even though, I don't really have a bias towards green energy, but even if I did, I found something very useful and harmonizing to myself. So I think number one is getting over some of those internal biases. looking at it for the benefit that which it provides. No, one battery is not going to change the world. One vehicle charger isn't going to change the world. But very similar to the elephant, eating an elephant, you do that one bit at a time. The second part to that, though, is if we were to just implement all this, we had a magical wand and we just fairy dusted in the 2.3 million chargers we need and the 16 gigawatts worth of battery energy storage that we need for our country just overnight, and everybody's running electric, and somehow the whole grid manages to not fall apart in our hands. If you did that, there would be a lot of areas that those products would be wasted. The goal is to implement these in an efficient and effective manner where the end user has a reliable place to charge their vehicle, has reliable and efficient continuous energy through battery energy storage. We have great areas where we're placing in solar. So if you're listening to this and you're on the side of yay green energy, yay smart grids, cool. If you're listening to this and you're sitting there deep inside going, this is never going to work, take a step back and think about in different ways how this can help our society. And there are a lot of positives. There's a lot of financial benefits to it. There really are some financial benefits. That's only one of my degrees is the financial side of it. So take a step back, remove some of that internal bias and see that, yeah, overnight it would never work. But slowly as we chip away at this, we're going to start seeing very good implementation that's really going to affect and help our industry. I'd say probably one of the other big obstacles is from the technology side. And this is one of the ones I put on my notes that I wanted to talk about. We do have a very big mix of technologies out there right now, and they are on the cutting edge. Do you remember getting your first smartphone, like your first whatever product you use, Android, iPhone, whatever it is, Sony, whatever it is,
Yes.
the flip phone?
I remember. It was Nokia.
It was Nokia. Okay. So it felt like the whole world opened up. But then it had a million issues with it. The cameras didn't work correctly. The apps didn't. I remember my first one. I was like, should go back to the flip phone. We're going to.
That was before the flip phone. But go ahead.
Okay, that was before the flip phone. So you can play Snake on your phone.
Yeah.
Well, as technology improves, so does the reliability, efficiency, and effectiveness, and the application to the targeted audience. Right. So some of these new technologies, take your time selecting them. Make sure that all the bells and whistles don't get you confounded and excited. Find what applies to your specific project and go with that product. There are so many out, there's such a plethora out on the market. You'll go to these conventions, there's 30, 40, 50 vendors of EV chargers. There's now a half a dozen V2G charging companies. There are a half a dozen to a dozen reliable battery manufacturers and dozens coming up from the roots. That doesn't mean the ones that are coming up are any better or any worse. That doesn't mean the ones that are established are any better or any worse. You need to really find the product without bias that's going to work for your project.
Yeah, that is quite a challenge. I mean, especially because of all of the disruptions that are occurring, in regards to the new technologies. It's not just charging. It's charging, batteries, solar, new ways to communicate and use the data to drive, customer demand programs. So, we as an industry have a lot to think about and thread. But I think, just to kind of play on two of your thoughts, is before there were massive infrastructure and roads, that cars were invented. So cars became before the roads that we built. And also I think it was in the book, Clean Disruptions. I think author Seba. But he talks about in 1904, New York City was full of horse and buggy. And by 1914, you couldn't find a horse and buggy on the road. And so there's that's the fourth industrial transformation that we're happening. Right, wrong, or different, as you talk about biases, we as an economy have grown off of embracing new technologies. What's happening to us right now is it's 8 different industries are vying their attention on the grid itself. So from the grid owner's perspective and looking big, I think, how we solve this is really remembering where our vision and our purpose is, which is to continue to serve electrical power. And it really comes down to, not boiling the ocean. And you're correct, like having the vision in sight and then executing on the projects and knowing that each individual project will be a challenge, and those people that are involved in that project, it will be new to them. And so, we can learn from others, but for us to do individual projects, you need to have core project management skills and really get down to like effectively communicating and driving towards an end goal. So I think, when we think about, is the grid ready, or like which technologies should we use, like the fundamentals are like interaction with us people and really creating projects that like will thrive as we transform through this like very challenging time.
All right, so Liz, I got a soft off-prompt question for you, a little bit of a volley. You've got to ask me a lot.
Oh, goody.
Yeah, you've got to you've got to at least they know these aren't canned. So, from the project manager, from the EPC side of the fence, we asked a lot of questions about how we're dealing with the industry's change, how we're engaging with clients, and how we're dealing with it. I think for all the utility listeners on here, from the utility perspective, as in the last year and a half, 2 years, is there anything any insight you'd like to give them, or anything you've learned that you'd want to share?
Yeah, I guess, with everything happening in the industry, especially, different roles that we play within the utility, especially mid-sized, small-sized utilities, it's all about really breadth and maybe less depth. I find it myself deep in a lot of rabbit holes. However, you're kind of asked to really review, assess, and really drive a lot of projects that involve many vendor engagements. And so I think, one fun fact is, one of my roles is really deploying and understanding ADMS, Advanced Distribution Management Systems. And along with that roadmap comes a DERMS, which is Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems. When we pulsed the industry about a year and a half ago, there was 140 vendors that are claiming to be a DERMS. The same thing with battery energy storage systems. Batteries come in all shapes and sizes, and there's, quite frankly, a significant amount of material that can be used. It's not just lithium ion, but also there's a significant amount of battery integrators. So like those that can help build the battery itself. And then when you think about a battery energy storage system, we're not just talking about car batteries linked up and put on a rack and then wired up like we know how to do for control houses, but we're literally talking about integrating the battery chemistry makeup of what it is itself, along with all the controls, the protection, the HVAC, and really the fire suppressant and the container within. And so with that is a significant amount of vendor engagements. So I guess really the advice is when stepping into these projects of the unknown, and now granted, a lot of these projects have been deployed and there's lessons learned and there's even, retirements thereof, but every utility is a fingerprint in itself and there's no peanut butter spread answer. So I think my biggest message is to be very discretionary and be very aware of what the scope is and the vision that you're driving, and stay within those bounds, and be very stringent, but be very aware of what decisions you're making and why you're making them as you move through and navigate the large innovation that's happening all around us. So great question.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Thanks, Liz.
Well, with that, I think, we can take this right into another 30 minutes of conversation, because I think everything that's happening, there's a lot. And I look forward to our continued discussions as we continue to inspire and innovate and electrify the audience of all things grid mod. So thanks for joining us, Brett.
Thanks again, Liz. And if anybody that's listening, you have a great question or you have a topic that's dear to heart, I know I said this last time, but feel free to drop us a line and ask us, and we'll try to dig into it. Hopefully keep it short and sweet, but with us, you never know.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.